Welcome back. In this lecture, I'm going to go over the events of Bleeding Kansas and then the writing of the Constitution. So if you're using my notes, they should look something like this, a timeline with some boxes in it with a start at the top and an end, and there should be 8 boxes. If you're using Cornell Notes, you're using Cornell Notes. So let's get going here. So let's just recap very briefly. When we left off, we were talking about the different groups of people who came into Kansas, the pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers, and they were voting on this issue of slavery. And well, what happened was the pro-slavery people from Missouri came in illegally, the border ruffians, and they voted in the first election. They nominated a pro-slavery government. The anti-slavery settlers thought this was a bogus legislature, right? And they nominate and elect their own legislature. So there's 2 competing governments right now in Kansas, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery, and tensions are going to run very high in the Kansas territory, right alongside the Missouri and Kansas border. This little inset down here shows some of the events. We're going to talk about Osawatomie, the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, and the sacking of Lawrence. So we're going to look at some of the major events. Not all of them actually took place in Kansas, but the events in Kansas sparked national outrage, and there were some major events we need to focus on as well. So let's kind of start with something not violent, and that is the Beecher Bible and Rifle Colony. So abolitionists, people who wanted slavery to be eradicated all throughout the United States, were helping fund to people migrating to Kansas, free settlers or free soilers. And one of those people was Henry Ward Beecher. Now, they typically were people who did not advocate for violence to be used, especially in ending slavery. And Henry Ward Beecher went straight a little bit from this message, and he actually provided funds to build the Beecher Bible and Rifle Colony. That's what it's later named. And so he gave money. It's near Manhattan, Kansas. And he actually funded the shipment of Sharps rifles, real guns, to these people to defend themselves from border ruffians, from Missourians coming over. And they were in these boxes labeled Bibles, and they did this so that these pro-slavery settlers would not suspect that there was any weapons in there. So not only just funding settlers coming over, but also arming them as part of these immigrant aid societies. So this is going to start to increase some of those tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. The start of the actual physical conflict starts with what we call the Wakarusa War. Now there's a Wakarusa, which is a concert outside of Lawrence, but it gets its name from a war that was started. It really wasn't a war. So basically what happened was this back and forth thing between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers antagonizing each other. Well, got out of hand at one point. A free stater was shot and killed by a pro-slavery man. Some pro-slavery men arrested a free state individual for attending an abolitionist meeting. And the appointed sheriff, Samuel Jones, actually decided that he was going to put his foot down on this little antagonizing between the two. And he actually rounds up like 400 men. They encircle the city of Lawrence and lay siege to it. They stop supplies from getting in. And that doesn't stop the antagonizing from going on. In fact, Lawrence has a few abolitionist newspapers that keep publishing very opinionated things about the Southern settlers, antagonizing them, making fun of them. And the pro-slavery people get very upset by that. And that leads us to the event known as the Sack of Lawrence. So again here, Samuel Jones, the pro-slavery government in Lecompton, says, we're going to shut these newspapers down from what we believe spreading lies about slavery. And so Sheriff Jones and about 200 men come to the town of Lawrence and pretty much destroy it, lay it to the ground. They destroy almost all the businesses, the Free State Hotel, and they destroy 2 newspapers. Abolitionist newspapers are in that town, the ones that were making fun of the pro-slavery settlers. And some stories say they actually dragged the news presses out and threw them in the river. Not sure if that's true or not, but they destroyed the town. And I think 2 people were killed in that event. So it wasn't bloody or violent in that case, but they did destroy a lot of property destruction in that town. And there will be a second time that Lawrence is destroyed, and it's actually during the Civil War. So this is where things kind of get intense. So just a few days after that, and this is coming out of Kansas now at the national level, we have this event that we now call the caning of Senator Charles Sumner. So Charles Sumner was an abolitionist from Massachusetts. He was a senator in the national government, and he came before the Senate and gave a speech called The Crime Against Kansas. And in it, he attacks the South with strong language. He makes fun of Stephen Douglas, who is the man responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he very much so upsets Southern congressmen, senators, and House of Representative members. So much so that this one man, Preston Brooks, and you see this lovely political cartoon here representing this event, who was I believe the cousin or the nephew of one of the people that Charles Sumner made fun of. He actually came into the Senate while things were going on and almost beat to death Charles Sumner with a cane. He was so beaten so badly that he was lying unconscious on the Senate floor in the national government. So the things that were happening in Kansas were spilling out into the national arena here, the national government. That's pretty insane. And we think that our government's messed up today. So there's that. We're going to get more with this guy here later, but I'm going to tell you about him in Kansas. John Brown. John Brown is an abolitionist, an incredibly religious man who lived in many different places, but he decides to come to Kansas with a few of his sons, and he's going to help make Kansas a free state. He actually is going to Lawrence when he hears that there's an attack that's going to happen, but he's too late, and he decides to retaliate in kind, and this is where things get very violent. So John Brown and his sons pull 5 pro-slavery men near Pottawatomie Creek, a little settlement, out of their houses in the middle of the night and kill them with point-blank shots to the head and with broadswords, brutally murdering them, cutting hands off, splitting their skulls open with the swords, and they leave them in the Pottawatomie Creek to be found the next morning. So he massacres 5 pro-slavery men with his son. Cold blood. And this is just kind of a little recap of some of the things that were happening in Kansas. Again, the 2 capitals, the Topeka Constitution, the Lecompton Constitutions, these 2 competing places. And we have the sack of Lawrence, and then very quickly after, John Brown's retaliation with Pottawatomie Creek. So a lot of this was back and forth stuff. And it didn't just stop there. In fact, John Brown tries to defend the town of Osawatomie from pro-slavery settlers. He goes into Missouri and actually frees slaves. He attacks towns. The Jayhawkers from Kansas, right, you have that vocabulary, they would go to Missouri settlements and attack those towns. Missourian border ruffians would come over and terrorize anti-slavery people and settlers. So it was constantly back and forth. And that's where we don't have the rivalry anymore between Missouri and Kansas, but that's where that came from when we played Mizzou. So that's where the Jayhawk comes from with KU, with Lawrence, right, being a major free state settlement, right, the one that was sacked. So that's where that mascot comes from. The Jayhawkers, the free state people who would go over and attack those towns in Missouri. In national attention again, we have a Supreme Court case that's heard called Dred Scott. And Dred Scott is the name of a slave. And he tried to sue for his freedom because he was actually the slave of a doctor, and the doctor had actually transported him into free territory, and he believed that because he was taken into free territory, he should be free. However, the Supreme Court disagreed with that. The Supreme Court did not grant his freedom. In fact, they said 2 things that weren't even brought up in the case. One, that African American black slaves, not citizens, sorry, were not citizens, and because they weren't citizens, they weren't even allowed to sue over anything. So that voided the court case altogether. But they went a step further and said that the government could do nothing to ever ban slavery in any territory. And this upsets the abolitionists, the free soilers or free staters, who do not want to see slavery spread anywhere else. It even goes against the idea of popular sovereignty. It's just if you want to bring slaves somewhere, you can. And so this just increases those tensions even more because the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, has stepped in and said slavery can go wherever it wants to go. They're not citizens. That's what they ruled. Violence again in Kansas. The Mariah Day Scene Massacre along the Mariah Day Scene River in Kansas. Pro-slavery men kidnapped a bunch of free state settlers, took them to the riverbed, and shot them right then and there. Only 5 were killed, but still 5 were killed. So again, I want you to understand this back and forth thing. There was constant little skirmishes between these two groups. Overall, there were about 200 people in total that might have been killed. So it wasn't, like an epic war or anything. But people did die over this issue of voting for whether or not slavery would be allowed to go in Kansas. So this all does finally come to a rest, especially as the Civil War gets closer and closer and closer. John Brown tries to actually attack an army arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, to start a slave rebellion. He's caught, captured in doing that. The South does secede from the Union. And that's when Kansas actually becomes a state, because they did actually try to ratify the Wyandotte Constitution before that time, but because there were still a lot of pro-slavery support in the national government for Kansas becoming a slave state, it never was ratified or approved. And so finally, when the Civil War breaks out and the South becomes its own country, Kansas actually gets to become a state. And the fourth and final constitution, the Wyandotte Constitution, outlawed slavery, and did a few other things, giving women more property rights. But it took that to actually make the state a state, was the Civil War actually starting. And that's it.